But how do you achieve that? Is there a stopping point where you can call a timeout, or what do you do?
That's a really great question, because I also think a lot of people around the country struggle with this, a lot of trainers and different schools. There's a couple of things you can do. When we do difficult conversations, say not only for mastery learning, but also for our second years, we're actually doing it right now in the afternoons. We acknowledge the given situation, right? Like when the SP walks in with the learners, we say, we just want to acknowledge these are hard topics. And so we're going to allow each other the ability to stop if we need it. And then once they are in the role play, if they do need to stop, they can. And then at the end of the role play, everyone is allowed a moment to kind of collect themselves, acknowledge that it was difficult, and then start with the communication feedback. And we also make sure that SPs are not like stacked with a lot of difficult role plays. Like we are very conscious of doing one and then maybe taking a long break and then maybe doing another one. Like we would never back to back them like we would with just like a, kind of a regular OSCE or assessment.
Oh, I've seen SPs leave from these sessions and they look emotionally exhausted. It takes a lot out of you, doesn't it?
Yes, it's like little mini performances. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Where you have to, they actually feel the real emotions. They really get into the role. Yeah,
that's true. And a lot of them have had lived experience and have been willing to share that with us, or they've had a loved one where, I remember one actor saying, I do this work because my mother had such a negative experience with her doctor. And instead of it turning negative for her, she said, I want to make a positive difference with the students here, which I thought was an incredibly beautiful way to turn a somewhat tragic storyline into something where, there's can be benefit down the road.
In my observations of some of these sessions, I've seen while they're doing the deliberate practice where the learner or someone in the room can call a stop, and maybe they just didn't like the way they said something, and then they can try it again and then get some feedback right in the moment. It's almost like rapid cycle deliberate practice.
Yeah, it's amazing.
All right, well, let's segue a little bit into how we use the OSCE assessments. There is a checklist that the faculty fill out for the Breaking Bad News, but I kind of want to get into the assessments that the standardized patients do and how you get them ready to fill out checklists and assess the learners. There is some literature on this and trying to achieve inter-rater reliability among standardized patients.
Right.
It is complex, but if you're looking at the literature, you can achieve it. But oftentimes, standardized patient agreement with a physician or someone clinical is harder to achieve. So can you talk to a little bit about how you do maybe they're high stake assessments for the students? Do your OSCEs determine if the student moves to the next round, or how do you use them? And then talk to me about how you get the standardized patients ready to do them and fill out the forms.
Sure. Yeah, because this is definitely like a different kind of component of SP talent. So for Breaking Bad, those are more simulated, role plays where there is a little bit of give, some variation can happen. That's a little bit more of a wider range versus like an OSCE. And we have these very strange mnemonics here. That's the upshot of that is objective, structured clinical exam, which then in a nutshell, that basically means that a student is going to go through multiple stations for their assessment. And within those stations, they really need to be as standardized as possible. So to your point, Jeff, and your question, the SPs absolutely have to learn a case as similar to the next SP as possible. Obviously, they're completely different human beings. They look different. They're going to be different in their delivery. But the case is really going to be the backbone of how they say things and when they say things. So to answer your question of how we get them ready, it's practice, practice, practice. Like I created like a checklist for the SP trainer and the SP that goes on the front of every case. And it kind of allows them to have accountability with, did you role play it a number of times? Were you able to practice using the computerized checklist? Were you able to write feedback? Were you able to review previous video footage? Things like that to help get them ready. And then based on that, the SP trainer will have them role play with them and also actually have them fill out the checklist if there is a checklist or evaluation criteria that the SP needs to do. But to answer your question, like the student's going to like go through the whole OSCE, like they're not going to really stop. So like if they have, SP if they have SP number 1, they're going to have the role play, then they're going to have their post write up, and then they're going to do the next case, their write up, their next case write up, et cetera. It's just going to be like boom, 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 if that makes sense.
So then what happens if the student performs poorly? Do they get a chance to do it again, or do they keep doing it until they get it and then move on, or how does that work?
Well, I mean, the SPs will complete their evaluation, the students will complete their post encounter, and then it's up to the clerkship directors or the medical directors, whoever's assessing it, to define whether or not they scored, so much off the standard deviation. And then if they did poorly, we might have some kind of retake for them. But in the moment, no, they're gonna do it like it's just, they're gonna go through each of the stations. They're not gonna kind of find out how they did until later. And that's kind of how we do it for the third year clerkship. Every 4, 6, and 8 weeks, we've got all of those students coming. They'll find out their scores. And not only that, but they'll also be able to read the feedback that the standardized patients have written for them. They'll write these narratives about how it made them feel. So by the end of, the fourth year, students have had just multiple opportunities to practice and test with standardized patients.
So it sounds like they're mini high stakes, right? They determine they have to reach a certain level of performance, but they are allowed to do it again if that performance isn't met. Well, as you know, we're big fans of mastery learning here, which gives people multiple opportunities to get to a very high level of skill. And I know our medical school is working very diligently to try and incorporate mastery learning into the curriculum. And in fact, the Breaking Bad, as you know, is a mastery learning curriculum where the learners can practice over and over again if they don't get it the first time, which is really cool because we want excellent clinicians in every scenario.
Absolutely.
So let's segue a little bit, because I know also there's some sessions where we use standardized patients just for physical exam skills. And one of my thoughts that I've always had, because I went through it even when I was a student at Northwestern, is that as much as we try, the standardized patient actors are still not clinicians, right? They're trained as actors.
Right.
So they're able to evaluate, for instance, if you put the stethoscope in the right location, but they're not able to evaluate if you hear the murmur. So my experience is that sometimes we use multiple modalities. So for instance, I can remember a long time ago when I was a student, we would do a cardiorespiratory exam on a standardized patient. They would evaluate you if you auscultated the areas in all the right places. Mm-hmm. And then you would go and work on Harvey, the cardiac simulator, to hear all the murmurs, and you'd be evaluated on that. Is that how you're still doing it?
I think that we don't, I totally understand what you're saying. And we do kind of some of that. We don't necessarily use the Harvey heart simulator in an OSCE because we would have to have maybe more than one. But to your point, I think, yes, SPs can evaluate physical exam skills and can figure out if a student is doing the criteria correctly. And if, in fact, during the role play, we want the student to have, quote, a finding, the SP would provide them with like a card, or when the student leaves the room and they go to write their post, I will have kind of built it on the computer where they'll have the finding there. I'm not a big fan of the cards, I'll be honest. It just really kind of breaks the reality of the role play. But also, I think it's to the credit both of the learner and the SP that they can acknowledge that. They get the card, they move on, and they're still in it. And it just says a lot about the fact that both the student and the SP want to make this work, if that makes sense. Like, it might say, oh, this is the finding I have with my lungs. Student reads it, they return it, and then they just right there in the role play.
Well, I suppose it makes sense in some ways because you have to walk before you run, and it's building on foundation where you need to know where to put the stethoscope in all the areas if you're ever going to even be able to hear what you're supposed to hear. So let's talk about specifically some of the clinical skills exams that individuals practice, because I know occasionally the students will focus on doing sensitive exams like breast exams or pelvic exams or rectal exams. So can you talk to me a little bit about how that differs in getting a standardized patient ready for that?
Absolutely. So the people that we have that teach and instruct the sensitive exams are actually kind of a subset of standardized patients. Many of them, that is all they do, is teach and instruct the sensitive exams. So our gynecological teaching associates, we call them GTAs, and sort of our male teaching associates, we call them MUTAs. They have been trained, and they also work at many of the area schools. So they might not necessarily be portraying a case like a standardized patient would be, but this is where someone in the realm of the pool would be kind of wearing the teaching hat. And what is really unique to this is that our students are afforded the ability to use task trainers, pelvic models, UGR models first, and they'll rotate through stations with faculty assisting and teaching them. And then they're allowed to practice on a real person where the person is actually using and instructing using their own body as the instrument. It's a really incredible population of people because they are absolutely dedicated to this part of medical education. They feel that it is so important for students to not be afraid of these maneuvers. And so we have just this incredibly unique and beautiful group of people that do this. And they start in the second year where we have a breast unit, a pelvic session unit, and a UGR unit. And then in the third year, our students go through the OB-GYN clerkship where they will have a kind of a crash course where they'll have some of these same educators come to teach this.
It's interesting because of all the sessions I did as a student at Northwestern over 20 years ago, I remember the sensitive exam sessions vividly like they were yesterday, because I just remember being struck at how dedicated the standardized patients were to teaching and how they actually took it upon themselves to teach the exam. But not only that, but you get the perspective of the patient, which is so much better because you can ensure that you're being sensitive emotionally and physically, I suppose, to prevent discomfort during these exams and the patient's giving you feedback, whereas in the reality, patients don't usually give that feedback.
I agree, Jeff. I think you're absolutely right. The amount of care that the GTAs and the MUTAs take, they'll have an evaluation form and they'll just be completely so specific to that learner. They'll know exactly what to say because usually these are in small groups. So like we'll have maybe 2 students to say a GTA when they're learning breast and pelvic, or we might have like 3 students to a MUTA when they're learning the male exams. And so there's just an incredible amount of courage, I think, and also skill to do that for the students.
So I have a few questions left before we start wrapping up. I'm kind of wondering about how, when you prepare and you go through these cases, any case with the standardized patients, what do you tell them about expectations for when they should break their role?
Well, we do want to emphasize safety. So, and I say this also to the students during their orientation, I say there is always a mechanism to help you when you're in a room with a SP. And we say the same message to the SP. So that is whether it's a practice session or a testing situation. So for example, if a student was causing, more than discomfort, if they were causing pain while they were doing a physical maneuver on an SP, absolutely, we would say to the SP, you have every prerogative to stop the encounter and to ask that learner to readjust their technique. And particularly when we're doing the afternoon practice sessions for communication and physical exam skills for the first and second years, there's a lot of that stopping and starting. Like, hey, we stopped this role play. Like, let's take a look at it. Do you want to redo a part of that where we found like kind of a rough patch? And so those are the places I feel like we would tell them, hey, you absolutely can break role. If a student like needs an instrument or the instrument's not working in the room, they would be able to come out. And I think that's also allows people to feel safe because it's just like a safe, healthy, educational environment.
Or what if, I don't know how often this happens because our actors are so amazing, but what if the SP accidentally messes up the script or something? Is that something that they can then restart? And
That's such a good question, Jeff. Yeah. In the assessments, we tell SPs like it's human to mess up and it's okay. Don't break the role play, but tell your trainer the minute that you remember or the minute that the student is out of your room. So for example, like, you might have forgotten to give them a card, or you might have said something like, oh, I told them my headache was 3 days, and I should have told them that the headache has been going on for like 5 days. Well,